All right, I'm Mark Richman. I'm founder of Skeleton Key. These days, I mostly run the business and do some sales engineering. But as you see, I've worn a lot of different hats over the years. I tried to come up with a clever alternative to a title slide. And even though I'm not a big fan of the art style, this is basically what it's about. You know, the hope is that you can look at a series of images, whether they're connected and related to sort of telling a story or a sequence, or whether they are disconnected, as you'll see several of those. And kind of get the gist of what someone is trying to communicate to someone else. My hope is you're coming here with questions, that I'll do some show and tell, we'll come to some understanding, and then maybe you guys will applaud or enjoy your time here. All right. So my name's Mark. Like I said, you can call me Mark. I don't like any other title. I've had a lot of different jobs over the years, and every single one of those jobs that I've had over the years has involved images in some way. I didn't really realize that, I think, until I was pitching the session and starting to put together my slides. But it's almost like they require some kind of use of drawing and images. So I've been doing this since back, really before college in my high school days. They all are jobs that solve complex problems. They also have all different kinds of definitions for who is the creator and who is the consumer and what the stuff is that's being created or consumed. And there's almost always a kind of a creative act here. Like there's nothing, and we make software, right? We have the code base, we have the platform, but we don't actually have any software when we start. The same is true when we're building a house. There's a vacant lot. You can see that looking out here at all the stuff that Apple's going to build. And in every one of these positions, I could come up with a scenario and an example like that. I've found in all of these situations, drawing and sketching and finding ways to get comfortable, being uncomfortable with those skills, even if you don't have comfort with pen and paper, practice and practice and practice can really start to make a difference. So I'm going to show you a lot of different examples of things. They're not going to be moving. They're not always going to be in sequence, right? So you're going to have to kind of connect with the idea that often these are just snippets and examples of things that are often part of a series that are otherwise presented. I've also known as dad or bro or a number of other things by my team. That's like a mix of my family there and people I went to high school with and so on and so forth, and my team, Skeleton Key. It's the same thing. Lots of different hats, lots of communication with people, almost always find in some situation that using a piece of paper, a napkin, a pen would somehow help me communicate more effectively with people. I was also solving problems in almost all these different scenarios with people at various stages of my life, and I found the same skill sets were useful. So even if you find yourself not being an engineer or a software developer, but you have another role in the business, my guess is that you'll hopefully learn some lessons today that might be useful even just sitting with your family, maybe trying to figure out what you're going to do with an aging parent or how you're going to handle a particular change in the remodel or repair in your house or helping your kid with a project or something like that. I find the more I pull out piece of paper or a whiteboard or something, I can communicate even with my 12-year-old a lot more effectively than I sometimes can with words. So I want 3 takeaways when we're done here. I want you guys to understand why visual communication is an important part of your toolbox. And if you're not using it now, you should start. Maybe you are, and I'm speaking to the choir, but I found a lot of people like me, when I go back and look at my older agreements and things I created for clients, it's all words, lots of words and lots of words and lots of words. And those words just really, I could have 10,000 words, I could have 20,000 words in one of those documents, and it would never necessarily connect the dots on what we were actually going to build. And of course, things like UI and UX and other kinds of practices that kind of emphasize the use of tools like that, they weren't around when I started doing this 25, 30 years ago. So it was something that back then I didn't know any better, but I was doing it meanwhile in the theater and all that other stuff. I just never connected the dots. I want you to be able to predict where particular types of diagrams could be useful. What kinds of tools, what kinds of sketches, what kinds of diagrams might be useful in different scenarios of project, and I'll break that down. And I also want to give you some tips on where you could start. A lot of it just comes down to experimentation and play, just kind of trying different tools, being okay with drawing really ugly drawings, whether you're using Visio and have technical support or whether you're grabbing a marker and going to the whiteboard. You have to be willing to create really ugly stuff. And I got several ugly examples of things that I sketched and scribbled that you could hardly read. When I go back, I'm like, what the heck was that word? But at the time, they were really effective in communicating to the person who was looking at the board with. I'm going to use picture, image, illustration, all different kinds of words to mean the same thing. I don't want anyone to get hung up on terminology. That's not the issue. In fact, the concept of a series has been plaguing me a little bit because I don't really address that in the slides. I'm also going to try to ad lib a lot and not just read the slides to you because you can read them later. I think you can download a version of this now. I think it's almost the same as the version that's up here, maybe some slight cosmetic changes. But I'll upload a final version. But the key idea here is, like I said earlier, is that it's rarely just a singular image. that makes the difference. It's often the sequence of images that makes a difference, or a collection of images. It could be an entity relationship diagram combined with a topology network infrastructure diagram combined with a process and workflow diagram that collectively help a client and you understand, or you and a developer or a member of your team work through a problem. It's rarely the singular image in isolation of the others. It's often the act of creating the image or the picture with that other person. And so that is almost like a living animation. We've all seen those cool whiteboard explainer videos, right, where it starts out and then eventually you have this entire workflow, but it's the creative act of watching it unfold that, with the narration, that really connects it. And of course, I'm not trying to say don't talk while you're drawing, right? You're going to talk while you're drawing, but the amplification you get to your message when you're drawing and talking at the same time is pretty dramatic. I don't think the camera will point over there necessarily, and I don't want to necessarily make things confusing, but if time allows, at the end, maybe we'll use the whiteboard and sketch some stuff out, talk about things if that'll help make connections. So this is my science slide, all right? You can go online, you can read tons of stuff out there about the science of cognitive visual research and how the mind works. And there's entire websites dedicated to it. There's entire fields and disciplines related to it. It crosses from computer science and UI and visual design. It goes into various disciplines like the ones I used to have when I had other jobs before I got into software development. And a lot of it gets into very specific research with people who have various disabilities and talks about how they, can augment certain aspects of their vision. But the key thing here, I think, to take away is that everything, if you can see and show someone something, gets easier to understand. It bridges the gap in communication. It can bridge different languages. It can bridge inabilities to understand things. We all know some people are visual learners and some people are tactile. But I know that in many ways, our discipline is very tilted toward the seeing public, right? So we're going to just take that for granted. But it isn't something to just kind of dismiss as sort of minor. It is major. I don't know if anyone here has ever followed someone online or knows anybody who has a lack of sight. It takes a lot to overcome that. It's an opportunity for us to benefit, to maximize communication. And this was the shortest I could make this slide because the amount of information out there that kind of proves the point that this is powerful stuff that will make a difference in communicating with other humans cannot be understated. So I'm going to hope that you'll take it for granted. That's why you're here, that this is worth learning and mastering if you already feel comfortable with it. You can see this every day, but you probably don't even notice it. In fact, I remember this morning, and of course the photos back then weren't digital, but I was 18, I went to Europe and I did the whole backpack thing. And I remember going into some place in Germany and I went into a train station and there was a series of billboards around the room that had these really gruesome pictures of children, babies usually. They were orange babies in line drawings and they were in various stages of peril, right? This one baby was falling out of the crib and caught in a drawing. And it was all just cartoonish. Another one was tipping over a bucket. And I walked around trying to figure out, and it dawned on me after I looked at all these were just, it was a public service announcement about the dangers in your home to small children if you weren't careful about these things. And I was in another country where I didn't speak the language. There was no signage to explain what it was. It took me all of about 30 seconds to figure out what this message was trying to communicate, and it cut across all those boundaries. I took some pictures of it back then, but like they were probably on a little Instamatic or something, and I can't find it. But to this day, I keep remembering that. It's like one of my earliest engagements with how powerful visual design could be at a time when I don't think that was something that was top of everybody's mind. You see it everywhere. You kind of almost ignore it. Cartoons, magazines, newspapers, billboards. You probably saw it when you were coming here on the road, driving down the highway. You probably noticed it when you're in the restrooms, figuring out which door to go through or whether or not you should pull or push something. I think we just take those kind of visual cues for granted, but they are very powerful things, not just on the software screen. So I'm not talking about the software itself. I'm not talking about how you should design your interfaces. I'm talking about the tools you can use to communicate before you start building. So let's talk about projects then. So there's a lot of challenges in projects. First of all, there's a lot of information, right? It's real easy to get overwhelmed with all that. And of course, we all want to write it down, make nice bulleted lists. I'm like the king of bulleted lists. I get comments from people about my emails all the time where I can't just describe something. I have to go in this, so that it's really clear, hopefully, to everybody. It's really easy to misunderstand each other. I'm sure everyone here at some point has thought they were on the exact same page as someone else on their team or a client they were building something for, maybe with the developer who was building something for you, only to discover that you were not on the same. We've all probably seen that illustration of the tire swing and like what the client wanted and what the contractor built and what the supplier thought they needed, and then all these different permutations when they would have just been happy with something much simpler. And I think that's real. I think it can be very expensive when that kind of misunderstanding happens. It's an expensive problem when you make those kinds of mistakes. It turns what is an opportunity into something that maybe even feels like a step backwards. And it can also kind of sour people on the entire thing that we do, which is build software that helps them make a difference. If we build software that actually under-delivers or underwhelms, that could be their last software project. We've probably all inherited a client who has loved and lost before, working with a developer who failed to give them what they needed. We don't have insight into why that happened. There's a lot of reasons, but I'm always certain that the lack of documentation, the lack of materials that were provided up front, the lack of shared understanding that was developed might have been the culprit. There's a lot of technical jargon. It's really hard when I'm talking to clients about where their stuff will be hosted and where their data will be and how secure it will be to make sure that they understand it. And when I'm talking with an IT resource and wanting to make sure that they're comfortable and confident in what we're doing, again, words sort of fail. You know, the sooner I can take out a drawing or sketch something on the board, the sooner I start to get nods, the sooner I can start to get relevant questions, the less I have to repeat myself. And last is just complexity. In my experience, this is a really hard problem. It's going to take a long time until AI or anything can do this for us, right? I even tried asking some image generative tools to kind of draw some interesting diagrams, and the quality was low. There's a lot of subtlety there. Style plays a part of it, and then you have to describe style, which is very hard. It's much easier to just show someone style. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here for us to still be relevant participants in this process. So I'm going to plant the seed that, on a typical project cycle, everyone might have their own particular circle that they use or diagram that they use to illustrate the different phases of a project. I'm not going to get hung up on grammar here. But there are distinct stages, and there actually are distinct opportunities at each of those stages to address some of those concerns with particular types of diagrams or visual representations. They may be in a different order, and in my world, this is my first opportunity to go off camera and draw something on the board. They're not isolated, right? In many ways, they're kind of all overlapping, right? I'm going to show you diagrams, and you're going to notice that as I go through some of the examples, that the same kinds of images show up on different sections of the presentation. And they both look like they're topology diagrams. They both look like they're entity relationship diagrams, or they both look like they're sketches of some kind of interfaces. And why are they showing up in design and also ideation? And the point is that there is no right or wrong way to do this. It's just doing whatever's going to connect you to that other person. I've found that depending on who's in the room and their level of comfort with the topic we're talking about and what kind of decision maker or champion or power user they might be, they might need to see a mix of these things at various times. And so I often will create items, especially when I was actively doing the day-to-day development, and keep evolving those diagrams and drawings as I go. So I might start out with a really simple sketch in discovery or ideation that I later take out and revise and modify again. So that kind of speaks to digital tools and how sometimes digital tools are really great because you can easily copy the file and then modify it and have a series to show over time how your understanding has evolved. Very different than when you draw something on the whiteboard, take a photo of it, and then erase the whiteboard. And then recreating that feels a little more awkward. In fact, I had to do a lot of hunting and digging to find some of my old whiteboard drawings from back in the day so I could share them with you guys today. So we're going to cover ideation. What are we trying to achieve in the first place? The planning and who, what, and where, and when are things going to happen? The discovery process, which a lot of people do a lot of different ways, but it really comes down to kind of coming into the mind meld with the person in the room as to what exactly it is, where they are, where they want to go, what they're trying to do, how they want things to change. Obviously, the design piece, which could be the entire presentation, but I'm not, like I said, talking about UI, UX exclusively here. That's just a component. There's the development, the actual making of the thing. There's actually opportunities there to actually use diagrams to continue to, advance understanding. And then the deployment process and understanding what it's going to look like to go from where you are now to actually putting it out into the live world. So we're going to go through these one by one. Ideation, is really that initial sketching. I remember fondly sitting at a restaurant in New York one time with my stepfather and a friend of his, and they were talking business, and it was completely over my head until his friend took out a big black marker, since it was his restaurant, and started writing on the white tablecloth. And first of all, I was super impressed, right, that he was writing on the tablecloth. Like, that was such a master stroke. But But everything he was talking about, he started sketching out. And suddenly here I was like a 10-year-old kid, and I was starting to understand these really big, they were talking about fleet sales and vehicles and insurance and all kinds of stuff. They were businessmen in New York. But I could understand and connect the dots between what they were saying, which was flying over my head, and the drawings that he was making and the numbers he was writing down. And even though I didn't even understand the math that was involved in what they were talking about, that really connected. By the time he was done, he'd covered almost the entire tablecloth. And then again, I was super impressed. We just walked out because I didn't realize it was his restaurant until later. But my favorite restaurants have been the ones where I walk in and there's like paper on the table and there's crayons and there's a pen. It leads to a better dinner. I've actually got scraps of that paper from dinners I've had with my wife over the years where we decided, like, what do we want to do this year? Or where do we want to go? Or how are we going to fix that closet in that corner in that shelf? And suddenly I'm drawing and sketching and using some of my skills there to kind of illustrate and communicate with her. And we obviously know how to talk to each other, right? So that's not the problem. It's just that this helped us accelerate that. And it also leaves something behind. Here I am talking to you. That's great. But if you didn't have the slides to take afterwards, then you'd have whatever your memory would support. And our memories are probably all variable. Mine's getting more variable all the time. So ideation is really where that begins. That's where that sketching, those mistakes can happen, where you can crumple a piece of paper up and throw it aside and try something new. It's often a way to kind of present an idea that maybe didn't exist and sort of start to form it. And so I've got lots of examples, but there's some technical ones. I think I don't have a lot of good sketchy ones. I found some from my architecture days, but they were a little bit ugly and hard to take photos of. So these are more technical. There's various tools out there for mind mapping. I've got some Miro boards that I participated in with Claris and with some consultants we've hired at Skeleton Key. But they're kind of big and bulky. But the concept is, on the right was several years ago talking and trying to explain to my team how our current onboarding and sales process might change and evolve to work with different people. So they can be really precise, pretty drawings using like Lucid Chart or using Draw.io or OmniGraph or whatever it is you prefer. Or they could literally be sketches like that on the board over there. Just a scribbly sketch. I've got another favorite one. I left it at the, I'm going to walk off camera again. I was trying to explain to people in my team the other day, and I think I've got this later in my presentation, about the changes we're going to make as a company in our investments in marketing and sales this year. So everybody was saying, well, that's great. Here's January 1, and here's December 31st, and we're going to, that's terrible. See, they can be ugly, but they still get the point across. And everyone was thinking it was going to be this kind of curve. We were going to start out and just like, a month in, we were going to be 1/12 of the way there. And the reality is, it's going to be like this for us. It's going to take some time to get those wheels spinning. We haven't had a marketing person on our team in years. And so I got to find them, hire them, onboard them, get them coordinated with our tools and our people, figure out the messaging that they're going to start with. And then somewhere maybe March, April, they'll be getting rolling. But then it's going to take some time for that to actually create results. That simple drawing that I wish I had shared with my team would have set expectations a lot better. We got to the end of January and they're like, well, what's going on over there? I'm like, I'm still in this phase. They thought I was here, but I was actually down there. And that simple sketch was enough to kind of connect the dots. Now, that was my idea, but I had only said it. I hadn't put it into a drawing. So I've got hundreds of those kinds of drawings that ended up in the recycling bin because they seemed like they were just enough for the moment in the discussion. Planning is a little bit simpler, right? You know what you're going to build. This is almost like the end of the process, but sometimes it happens early on. The client's like, well, we're committed to doing this, or we know what the scope of work is. We haven't even done discovery yet, so I know these aren't necessarily in the order they always will be, but maybe it's more a matter of, I know we're going to do something, I know we're going to do discovery, I know we're going to spend the money, I know we're going to spend the time, but we obviously need people to do that, right? And there are going to be key stakeholders and subject matter experts who need to be part of the process. Well, when are they going to be available, and how is this going to align with our target to get something out the door? A lot of our client projects start with, we need this by September 1st. So we have to start talking about September 1st as sort of a launch date before we even know what we're building. In fact, in some ways, that'll become a constraint in the project that will help us understand how much we can build in the first place, right? How much they could spend in the first place. And so the earlier and more often we create planning visuals, I think the easier it is to make sure that we actually arrive. I think I've seen a really great, John Sindel, our seed code, has some really great blog posts where he talks about our concepts and perceptions of time. But these blog posts are always accompanied with really phenomenal diagrams that really illustrate conceptually what's really going on when something interrupts you and then you have to get started again, and how you start to lose time over the course of the week. And we lose more time than we actually think we're losing. And that way we're always late. It's why at my house on our board in our kitchen, it says, early is on time. It's a reminder to our family that, we've got a plan for the interruptions that will inevitably make us late all the time. There's lots of common visuals. This is just an example of my calendar this week and the sessions I'm in, plus my family calendar behind the scenes. It'd be a lot easier to tell you I'm busy by just showing you my calendar than to walk you through every single thing that's going on with my family and me this week. On the left top, that's a Jira project Gantt chart. That's an example of just showing all the different dependencies and sequencing of epics and issues that we're managing in the development of a tool that we built recently called Gloss. And then the bottom one is really just a Fibonacci sequence. I don't know if everyone here is familiar with that, but it's just an order of magnitude. It's an easy way when estimating that we use a skeleton key to compare the relative size of things. And I can tell that to people. I can give them a string of numbers, and I can see a lot of blank stares. And then when you take out this and say, this is what that means, everyone gets it. All right, so this becomes like a really quick, almost like a mnemonic device to remind my people what the difference is between a 3 and a 21. Seeing it somehow is more impactful than actually just hearing it or seeing the number itself. Discovery. So we could have a whole session on discovery and where visuals come into play. It often is the place in the project where they first come into play. Clients often, when they're ideating, are just talking about visions of success or changes in how things will be, and it seems inconvenient or premature to maybe start sketching and diagramming things. And sometimes maybe even the format on a WebEx or in a meeting with them, it just doesn't seem appropriate to do it at that point. But when you get into discovery and you start to talk to clients, we have adopted tools now in our practice to start drawing as soon as possible, right? To start using some kind of tools to start putting that down, especially if those tools are malleable, right? If they're a whiteboard where I can just dirty my fingers and rub it off and kind of put some more on there, or if I can take out sticky notes and stick them on the actual physical wall and then move them around really easily so that I'm not kind of setting anything in stone, nothing permanent. It's a lot less expensive to experiment in those kinds of tools than it is to build the wrong thing and then have to redo the code, right? This is all pre-development activities. And you capture things here like how it is working now, maybe how they want it to work later, where the pain points are. And a lot of those visual tools provide really convenient ways to indicate that difference. I could grab that red pen over there, and I could have drawn the first line in red to indicate that was somehow not the line we were going to use, or use it to circle the dot where they thought we were versus the green where we actually are. And those kinds of visual elements can actually, the color elements can actually make a difference. There's a whole bunch of stuff in that cognitive science piece that doesn't even mention the use of color and how that can actually take your drawings to a whole new level. So you're going to see color in some of my drawings. Often it was whatever marker worked in the room at the time. But when I had a good set of markers, sometimes I could use color to illustrate it more. So this is a range of different examples of types of tools we've used over the years. But again, not enough room on one slide to show them all. There's a process diagram for an IT team we used to have as part of our company and showing all the different ways clients send information in. And we kind of had a rough drawing of that on a board, but then I made a pretty one just to kind of make it a little bit more permanent and easier to share. And we started putting a lot of extra detail on it. So that was a diagram that started out like this, and then eventually accumulated enough detail to really become almost like a decision tree that was used by the team in real time when they were working and used by some of the developers and admins and the automations and setups that they would do to try to find ways to get things to be done automatically. That middle one is a really ugly drawing that I did at the very early stages, almost like an ideation meeting, but it was the first meeting where we brought together all these teams in a large corporation who were all trying to get products to market and who were all struggling using Excel and all these different tools to do it, and to help them understand that we could build a singular system and they could each have their own different view into the piece of the data that they needed at the stage of the item that they needed to see it. And so no one really understanding when we were talking about it. Like, in fact, the client who brought us in had this vision for what he called mothership. And he would talk about it, and it was actually a creative team. He thought someone would have drawn it at some point, but no one had drawn it yet. So I was like, well, help me understand. So I just started drawing on the whiteboard, and it was a room of like 20 people. By the time we were done, like everybody was nodding. They all understood finally what this guy was talking about and what we could possibly build. And then several years later, we built it. A couple hundred users are using it, and this pain point in the organization went away, but it started with that diagram. Another one was just trying to show someone a little bit about how people would work on iPads, and then people would hand in paper, and then time would go by, and then information would get typed into a Microsoft Access solution, and eventually that would go up to the web. And again, I was trying to understand what they were telling me their workflow was, and they didn't have anything to give me to help me understand it. So I drew it in some ways for me, just to make sure I was understanding it. But then that became a seminal drawing shared with the developers on how they were going to actually build this thing. Stories on board, that's just a digital version of the sticky notes, and they stick better. They don't fall off the wall. And it allows you to color things. So we can say, that red card there, that's a hot spot. That's the most important thing on that board. That allows us to maybe focus in on the MVP and what we think we should build or solve first. And then a topology diagram at the bottom there. That was me just, again, trying to help a client and me understand exactly how things were getting connected digitally so they could understand. These are all things that could come out of a discovery, even though some of them may be appropriate to use later as well. Now we're going to get to the design piece, right? So, like I said earlier, we kind of assume vision and touch are part of our solutions. There may be people in this room and some people here at this conference who are building software for people who are, can't see or have difficulty interacting with a computer, with a keyboard and mouse. But we're spoiled. A lot of us have the opportunity to build solutions where we know they're going to be able to interact with it, touch it, click on it, and see what we've created. So design and user experience is really important. And I'm going to bias these comments a little bit toward the seeing, the ability to do that. This has been a big change for us at Skeleton Key, I'll admit. Some time ago, maybe 2.5 years ago, we really started to have members of our team start to get certified and learn the necessary skills to bring UI, UX practices into the company in a more formal way. We had been doing that really informally for years, but inconsistently. Some of us were really into creating storyboards and mockups, and others didn't. Sometimes people created mockups and they never had an actual user test the mockup before they built something. Yes?
What sort of certifications and training?
I think my team members are taking the Nielsen Norman series, UI, UX, and I think it started with an assessment. We had kind of assessed ourselves as an organization. I forget what the scale was, like let's say 1 to 10. And I think we were like a 2, in terms of consistency, knowledge, regularity of practice, belief that these practices can make a difference in the quality of software development. I think we're now at a 3. And we've got a handful of people who have been certified over a couple of years. They're slowly rolling out things like prototyping and monitored usability testing and evolving templates and standard design patterns. But it's not like we didn't know about this stuff. We had someone come out to our staff conference 8 years ago and present on UIX, and we all thought that was really cool. And then we all went back to doing it the same way we'd always been doing it. So this has brought language and terminology into our conversations. I think we call it the 10 usability heuristics, things like recognition of errors and pattern and discoverability and other things that we can use to assess whether or not the designs we're going to eventually implement and the things that we build are actually going to work. And it's led to conversations where we've actually critiqued each other's interfaces to identify ways to make them more powerful and more useful. And now my team is actually starting to do things like sketch out interfaces really quickly and have users actually navigate them and not lead them through the process, but say, where do you think you should click? What do you expect to happen? And to kind of listen and learn to make sure that these solutions are better. I remember seeing a great presentation by Sarah Severson several years ago at a DevCon before there was an Engage, called the Essential Foundation Phase. And she showed some pictures of a cherry. It was an organization, I think, that was selling cherries. And they were trying to build an interface and figure out the best way they could do quality control. And it was a sketch in balsamic that was printed out and put on a clipboard so it could pretend to be an iPad. And they were standing there by the cherries and pretending to interact with it so they could observe whether it was intuitive and clear, if things were in the right position, if there was excess hand movements. These were practices before they built anything. They've obviously discovered what they thought they needed, they sketched what they thought they should build, and people actually pretend to use it to learn about it. So design is more than just making things look pretty. It is really a thoughtful approach to now taking these diagrams to help understand things and start to turn them into something more tangible that people can actually touch. So these are some examples of things that I've sketched over the years. Really scribbly and messy, obviously, in some cases. And probably when I was talking to the person I drew that with, it made a lot of sense. Now it just looks like a big spaghetti mess. That one on the far left was a mobile solution for donation food pickups in the St. Louis area by a charity. And they had all these agency volunteers, lots of different users, none of which were going to get training, none of which were really necessarily strong computer users. You think what the volunteer community might be around food banks, and it was not going to be young and the IT related. It was going to be everybody's mom and dad and grandparents. And so we had to sketch interfaces to think about how simple we could make this. And when I compare those to what we actually built, they're very, very similar. But that was an early stage diagram to kind of connect the dots for the decision makers on making an investment in this project to understand what it is that they might actually be buying. Another example of an iOS interface, again, probably made more sense when I showed it. And a little tip of the hat to Codance and some of the folks back in the day, that's a FileMaker confidential slide from a 2014 or 15 presentation where they were talking about wireframes and how a picture's worth 1,000 words. Obviously, inflation, pictures are not worth 1,000 words. These are not new ideas, right? But even though I saw that and took all those photos, I didn't come back to my team and say, wireframes from now on, we're going to start to do this for all our projects. Thought it was a clever idea. Didn't know that I was maybe even doing it myself, but didn't make anyone else on my team do it unless it was something that they felt naturally comfortable. I'd strongly suggest you don't let this be the kind of thing which only one person in your team does, but everyone starts getting comfortable. It'll help you communicate with each other. And then obviously you have the nuts and bolts, right? This is always my favorite part. Back in the day, I was the kind of person who would jump right into a conversation with a client. I'd start creating the ERD. I'd start creating the relationship diagram. It helped me understand the relationships, and I don't think that's a bad thing. But that's not enough, right? That doesn't necessarily resonate for the client. It might help you tell the story verbally to the client later, how things relate to one another, but they might be wondering how it's going to look on the screen. So again, back to the other diagram, none of these types of drawings are necessarily in isolation to one another. So this can work for you, whether it's just you, maybe to leave behind for your future self, what the heck you were thinking when you were actually building that thing, or maybe for members of your development team if you want to be able to delegate and allocate work. But they often are the most technical things that get created. A lot of the stuff before that could be sketchy and rough, but here's where we maybe sometimes come up with more specific things. And it often embodies a lot of important details about how the data will actually work. So again, I've got another infrastructure diagram. In this case, I'm trying to display how integration and data will flow down here in the bottom right. I've got various ERDs I've created, some with optionality, some with some color coding to help the client understand sort of the different components or modules of the system. Some informal ones that I drew on a board that really connected the dots. Even when I've got a couple drawings I didn't bother putting on here that were just like 4 squares. But that was necessary for the client and I to really understand how simple or complex their problem was. And for them to feel confident that I really understood the relationships between the different entities that were part of their problem. And even that top left corner, it's stories on board again, but it's using that same tool to create something called an object map, which is a different approach. It's a sort of a more modern approach to creating relationship diagrams. Instead of diagramming it like this, you're creating it at the object perspective. Does this item relate to other items? And if so, how does it relate? Hard for me to read that one, I'll admit, but the nice thing about these disciplines is that there isn't a right way to do it. There are several ways you can do it. You could run on a whiteboard, you could use an object map, you could go full tilt with OmniGraffle or some other tool of your preference. And then we get to deployment. Deployment often feels like, well, all our work is done, but it's often an area, I think, where the lack of documentation on how we deploy things becomes a future technical debt, right? How is all this stuff actually deployed? Where is it actually installed? What are the required connections and connectivity and ports involved? Do we have any kind of documentation built into the system or separate from that to help future users understand how to use it? Or is it just so intuitive that they're going to understand it because our UX is so good? And so this could seem like an afterthought. Why would you spend all that time building something and then spend more time diagramming and documenting when the software should speak for itself? And I've often been a proponent of that, at least inside the scripts and things, right? Keep them simple. They should tell you what they're all about. I don't necessarily have comments, but the more I was creating this slide and thinking about it, the more I think that's perhaps wrong. These diagrams at the end of the project can really make a difference as well. So again, more topology diagrams. That top right diagram was actually the status quo of the client's current solution when we first encountered them. It took me several days to come up with the correct version of that because they had zero technical documentation to explain how it was all configured. And it was a pretty complicated solution. It had multiple synchronization technologies, multiple database technologies, multiple data centers involved, and one person had it all in their head how it worked, and nobody had a drawing of how it worked. So I had to convince them that it was worthwhile for me to spend time designing that drawing. There were 2 subsequent drawings afterwards that were significantly simpler, showing how we were going to change it and make it much simpler. So simple you might not need a drawing to understand it. It was a triangle, 3 points. But we still drew those different versions of it so they could see the before and after. It helped us leave behind something that sort of said, here's where you came from, here's where we went to, and now you can use that if that ever needs to evolve again or you need to troubleshoot. Bottom right was a series of storyboards. We used that storyboard drawing to help a client understand how the system was going to work. And it was so similar to what the actual system was at the end that we decided to use it as part of the training and onboarding of new users, because it was easier for them to understand those simple drawings, for them to actually look at the actual software screens and get caught up in all the details, right? They would look at those, they'd see the field names, they'd see the fields, they'd think about what could go in that field, and they started reading the descriptions above everything and the headers, and we were like, no, it's this simple. And then once they had that training, they could go in and they could just start using the system. So again, look like topology diagrams. Some are drawn, some are used technical tools, and even storyboards can be used as a mechanism for training and documenting how a solution works so that users who are used to doing it a different way can understand it. But there are pitfalls, right, all on the way. Requirements change. So this kind of speaks to the series component for me. It's not about having one picture and then putting that in a drawer and forgetting it. It's taking that picture out, like that example I talked about with that complex configuration for that one client, and being able to refer to them over time as the solution evolves, right? Being able to see what the ERD was, what it is now, what the plan was for the storyboard and how that's changed, how the story map changed and what version you did and what you're going to do next and which new stories need to be stuck in there, what cards need to appear. You can also create really bad visuals that make things worse, right? So this isn't just draw it and send it to the client. I think I want to reemphasize what I said before, drawing it with the team members, whether they're your clients or your co-developers, that's a critical piece of this puzzle. It's the narrative that goes along with the drawing that helps make that drawing useful to that audience. Very few of these drawings that you can see looking here at stuff I drew years ago with someone else resonate as deeply for the people who weren't there, right? As they do remind them, right? I think one of the things we talk about when we look at stories, well, that's an object map. Go back to the stories on board. One of the things I love about story mapping as a concept, and you can look up story mapping, I think this guy Jeff Patton wrote a book on it, is it doesn't even matter how good the cards are. What matters is they create communication. The cards are enough of a reminder of what the topic was that you can actually have a conversation. So it's like cards, communication, and conversations, right? There's this idea or something like that. Forget that. See, I need a reminder of what that acronym is. But the gist of the idea was that we shouldn't sweat the details of what's written on each card. What's more important is that they're enough to remind us what they were intending to remind us of, so we can all be on the same page again quickly, much more quickly than we would if we had to just do it verbally or visually scanning through tons of text. There can also be cultural barriers, and there could be barriers in language despite the drawings. I've got a great road sign that I might have taken when I was on that same European trip, brought home with me. That's like a man wearing a cap, digging, like with a shovel, but he's definitely not wearing a hard hat. He's wearing like, very jaunty cap. And I was trying to figure out like what it was. And it was, I think we were in Germany again in Freiburg, and it was the men working sign. That was their men working sign. And again, I knew what it was. I could recognize what it was, but it wasn't familiar to me. I thought it was kind of cool, so I took it. I was 18, so I didn't know any better. But I can tell you, even though I had those two examples I gave you about my trip to Germany back then and the kinds of signage I saw and the kinds of things I saw that made sense to me, I was just recently in Canada, and there was all these green exit signs with a person running and an arrow. And I kind of, like my wife and I were looking at it, we were like, is that the exit? Is that like, is there an emergency? Like, is there an avalanche? Like, what is this about? And I realized that was their version of exit. We're so used to the red exit signs, right? Apple's got the green ones here, right? But there can be these kind of moments that kind of cause that gap to happen. And they could be related to all kinds of things, whether it's culture, language, etc. So that's another thing to keep an eye out for. It's not just creating the drawing. It's confirming with the person you're talking to or sharing it with that they understand what the drawing means. So there's still going to be a words component. It's not purely visual. And then, of course, keeping these things up to date. That great drawing I did of that complex architecture, which showed how it got to be simpler and became a triangle, was fine. But if we don't maintain that as they continue to evolve the technical stuff outside the view of the development team, then that will soon become an artifact that is obsolete and actually misleading. So it's important, if you do start this practice, that you import the meaningfulness of this to the people who are doing it with you so that they can help keep that information up to date, especially in that post-deployment. All right. Just a few more slides and then I'll stop because I want to make sure we have plenty of time to chat. There's a lot of ways you can get started. You're not going to be a great drawer. Those are not great drawings. I don't need them to be. They just need to be good enough. A few lines may be all it takes to kind of get people to understand things. And over time, you start to learn what works for you. These are some recent sketches, and actually some not so recent sketches we did. Really rough story mapping that we did during a staff conference with sticky notes on the wall that wasn't made for sticky notes. A quick diagram I did on the board by industry to kind of figure out where our ideal customers were for 2024. Trying to use arrows to visualize that for members of my team. Some sketches I did of a tattoo and all the different ideas for my wife before we came up with the final version. That drawing I told you about, that's the one I've been holding up in meetings for 2 months now, showing people what to expect versus what they might have expected. And then these are really old sketches from back in my theater days where I was just brainstorming with the director about what the stage might look like versus what the actual technical drawings came out with at the end. All of this stuff was done just physically. None of this required any digital technology whatsoever. We all use computers and devices though, and so there are a lot of technical tools out there for you to use. Stories on board in the top left, or one of those stories. I don't actually know if that is Stories on Board. It might be their old style. That's Visio on the right, where I was trying to explain different storage technologies years ago in a previous life when I was an IT guy more than a developer. OmniGraffle, I think, on the bottom right. I think we got some Solmic over there on the left. I don't even know what that is. It's probably Draw.io in the middle. There's lots of tools out there. Some of them are free, like Draw.io. Some of them cost money, like Lucidchart and Solmic. Some of them integrate with other development tools, like Jira. Maybe something integrates with Devin out there. I think you got to figure out which tool works for you. Some kind of come and go, like Figma, right? So there's no wrong or right tool. And often you need a collection of tools sometimes to be able to do it. I used to be, OmniGraffle could do everything, but then I've learned over time that the precision that it offered wasn't good for the developers. They needed something rougher like the Solmic that was a little easier to use. And then you get into things like design patterns and templates and how you can use those things to quickly create diagrams. So you don't have to start from scratch. I have some canned topology diagrams. It's hosted on FileMaker or Cloud. You have iPads at home and in the field. You have people back at the office. I don't need to draw that every time. I just need to change the client name and the date. And so I just take out the template and use it again and change a few things. All right, a couple more things. I cannot recommend this book enough. All right, Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. There was no comics other than the very first one in my presentation, but I've been a comic reader since I could read. And I still occasionally read comics and graphic novels when I have time. If you are good with Google, you could probably even find a PDF of it online somewhere. I stumbled into one the other day, but it's worth the purchase. He breaks down the way we consume visuals as humans, sometimes in conjunction with words, and how it helps us understand. And he gets into the cognitive science. In a graphic novel, every page is a lesson and understanding. He goes back to ancient times and hieroglyphics. It goes all the way to modern times and sort of animation. But there is so much relevant material in that book for understanding the power of visuals. Even something as simple as the difference between a car and a car with 3 lines behind it. Instantly, we know that car is moving, right? And that's something that no one has to teach you. You just get it, right? And so he talks about how those kinds of things have adapted over time. Use of multi-panel to kind of give an impression of time changing. Scale, perspective, et cetera, and so forth. And so there's a lot of great inspiration in that book. On the other end of the spectrum, you have a whole series by this guy, Edward Tufte, which is enormously dense and complex. It gets into visualizing information and envisioning information. It kind of borderline gets into charting and the concepts of quantitative analysis of information. But again, lots of great lessons there. That's about comics, but it really isn't. This seems like it's about charting data, but it really isn't. It's all about how we consume information as humans and how visually messages get sent to us, and you can use that to communicate with others if you can master some of that basic stuff. All right, I've got on the slide in the speaker notes, and I'll share this. I got to figure out the right place, probably in the community. A whole bunch of other recommendations we could go. There's the Visual Communication Quarterly, which is a journal. There's a bunch of websites like IEEE Explore, a bunch of publishers who put out stuff about visual. These are just 2 of my favorite at different ends of the spectrum, easy reading and not so easy reading. But there's a lot of great resources online that can give you additional examples. All right, that's all my slides. Now it's time to share your own stories of this or ask questions, whatever you want to talk about. Sir.
You keep making a reference to balsamic. How does that spell?
BALSAMIQ.
Correct. BAL.
Like balsamic vinegar.
Yeah.
But it's
A Q at the end.
Q at the end instead
Correct.
of a C. Yeah.
I always get the spelling. That's the hardest part of that program. Spell it. But fortunately, when you spell online, you'll find it even if you misspell it. They make a standalone application. I know you can run on your Mac. I don't know if they have a Windows executable. They might. We use it now in Jira integrated so that our issues can actually have diagrams attached to them. So any member of our team can actually see those without having to download or bring it onto their local machine. They even have a cloud environment where you can do it and share it inside that cloud and share it with clients as well. But that was, I think we fiddled with that software for years, and it's only in the last 6 months that we adopted it for the whole development team. So I'm not saying it's the best one. I think it just turned out to be one that enough people liked and were willing to start using. And for us, it was the integration with our tool set that was really a critical feature. Yes?
You mentioned that, and I think we all agree over time, it can be hard to remember what you meant by, a drawing or a diagram. When you're in a process with a client, how do you establish some continuity around diagrams when even, 2 weeks later, we may not remember exactly what we meant? What are some of the things you're using to supplement that process to keep, to establish and maintain continuity with your ideas?
Right. So there's 2 primary ways. One is really expensive, and that is report everything. And have a good retention policy so you can keep those recordings, right? So I found this one diagram from the pandemic, one of those pictures in there, on a recording. I couldn't find a photo. I was able to find a recording where I was showing them the whiteboard as I was drawing it and explaining to them the drawing. And then later another recording where I was showing it to the decision makers. I built it with the power users first. So for me, those recordings are a little tedious to reconsume, but they are some of the best artifacts because they literally capture the moment, right? And whether it's the pandemic or just your normal life, we tend to use recorded meetings we have for 14 years, right? So pre-pandemic. The other way I've always been a big fan of is I always feel like everyone leaves every meeting nodding and then walks away with an entirely different impression of what that meeting was about, right? So whether it's an internal meeting with my team or whether it's a meeting with a client, for me, a post-meeting summary or recap is essential. And I'm, like I said, a big fan of bullets. And I'm a big fan of attachments and screenshots. So I will inevitably attach a PDF or attach a screenshot of what I just went over with the client and say, as discussed, this diagram illustrates the following key important things, ... Here's a link to the video, and leave that artifact behind. Since I'm in sales engineering now, which means I'm basically trying to figure out if the client and us are a good fit and if the platform's a good fit, I have a handoff responsibility to my developers. And if I've done any sketching along the way, because I'm that kind of person who likes to do that to make sure I understand, I'm recording that meeting, I'm sending that email, and when I have that internal handoff to my development team, that's something I give them. And it becomes sort of like the very first artifacts for the project. And often when I talk with the developer to say, how's that project going? And I see that they've veered off course, my first reference is say, well, what happened between here and there? Maybe it's a good reason you went off course. Or maybe you forgot to look at the artifacts I left behind.
Thank you.
Yeah, but storage isn't cheap. We've got gigs and gigs of storage and videos. Yes, sir.
You are a rapid speaker, as am I. One of the things that I like about that engagement with a whiteboard with a client is it forces you to slow down. Right? There are times when I'm 20 steps ahead of the customer, and it's important I bring them along with me. And going to the whiteboard allows you to go, number one, this is our work order module, right? You get instant validation from the people. They get to participate in it, not just hear a stream coming from you. They get to actually interact, give you validation and all that.
Right.
So it's a good tool for me to slow myself down by going to the whiteboard because I can't draw as fast as I can talk, right? The other thing, another tool that's really useful, you get those stick figure whiteboard things. I like to throw those into Keynote or PowerPoint sometimes. Really basic, like you do the recap, but it's also something that you can slowly animate over time and show, here's our original drawing, and then we added these bullet points or we have these connecting pieces. So you can actually show it build over time. So it's a nice way to show the simplicity of where it started and how it got to its final destination.
Right. I would in fact say I completely agree. I prefer the whiteboard because of the slowing me down. If I take out a finished drawing that I put together between the meetings, it was amazing. I was going through all my drawings on my hard drive and just finding stuff that we never won as a deal. And it was because I had the meeting with the client, wrote down a bunch of notes, went back and drew an ERD or a diagram to help me understand it, used it to narrate brilliantly to the client exactly what it is I thought they needed, And they weren't there for the creative act. They didn't actually see it. I wasn't drawing it in front of them. I wasn't doing slow enough. They had to absorb that all at once, right? It was very technical. I had lines and dashes and stuff. And I was talking and telling them the story, but it was separate from the creative act. And I think one of the reasons we didn't win a lot of those deals over the years is because I didn't actually have them along the way. I lost them, right? And at the end, I was like, wasn't that a great trip to the top of Everest? Look at the photo. And they were like, still at base camp. So, absolutely agree, 100%. Yes, sir.
Do you ever find people are resisting or looking down on diagram drawing, not wanting to participate in it? Do you ever experience that?
A great question. I can't remember. I think one of the biggest resistance I've had has been when I've asked someone else to sketch something for me. Can you illustrate that for me? And I'm not a good drawer, right? They say, I'm not a good drawer. I'm not comfortable with that. This happens a lot at my house. Like I'll go up on the board and I'll draw something, and I'll be trying to explain to my kids or my wife something, and then the vice versa. They'll try to explain something to me, and I'm not getting it, and I'm asking them to sketch it, and they don't want to. So I think it's more likely there. And I think, again, back to David's point, making ugly, simple drawings to help communicate your ideas gives the other person permission to make ugly, simple drawings to communicate their ideas back to you. But otherwise, I've never had anyone do anything other than, even if they're not a visual person, it's still just an additional compliment to whatever it is we're talking about.
There are times when the customer comes with really complex drawings that they're trying to convey to you. And I take that as an opportunity to do a simple, let me see if I'm understanding you correctly. And I do a simpler version of it in a whiteboard to help me, number one, am I getting this right? And also to just simplify it, because sometimes they come with that incredibly dense workflow diagram and you're like, well, let's start a little simpler and make sure that I'm getting where you're at along the way. That can help sometimes, you know.
So,
I think I find it a useful technique for those times when you need to indicate to a client or potential client that they're wrong, as in, this is what you've told me you want, but have you considered that this is a possibility, and drawing another little box going, oh, and people will come to you through this route, not the route that you've just decided, because it's actually quite hard to tell them that they're wrong in words, but when you do a drawing where you've added more to the process, and they begin to see that you are thinking on their behalf is the other thing that it does, is you are trying to think like you're a member of their team. That's a valuable use of drawing technique while you're in that conversation.
yeah, I think that's one of the reasons I didn't win some of those jobs, is I came across as sort of this is a finished good, right? And this is how you should do it. It wasn't a collaborative act, right? Where we could agree and disagree and crumple things up and then eventually arrive at a combined result. It was I'm bringing these tablets down from the mountain, share them with you. And they were like, no, thanks. Not so good. You reminded me, actually, I think one of you, of an example with storyboarding we did for a client, where we did this massive storyboard with these cards to understand their workflow. And then somewhere along the way, they were kind of evaluating, should they fix this solution or should they abandon it? They were going to an industry standard solution. We were just kind of helping them through that. That was the scope of our work, was just understand what they're doing and whether or not it was worth, there was enough juice for the squeeze to actually repair the solution that they had that someone else had built years ago. And at the end of this storyboarding process, they were like, this is the first time we've actually ever seen our entire workflow diagrammed visually in a way that we would like to use. So forget about the software project for a minute. That storyboarding technique alone was something that they were suggesting we go out and sell as a service, which I had never really thought about. But it was the first time, when about a year later, I was talking with another client and I was explaining how we use the storyboarding as part of our process of story mapping. And I said, do you happen to have any documentation about how you guys work? Any SOPs, anything that explains what you work? And he goes, no, actually, it's a huge failure in our company. Like, we hire new people, we have to invest hours upon hours to walk them through how to do everything. And it really is an impediment to hiring and onboarding and getting quick. And it takes key people off their main jobs. If we just stop the project there, you suddenly are business and workflow consultants. And all you're really doing is documenting through interview how they work, even if it ain't broke. And so there's a lot of value in here for the client early in the process when they start to see how their business works now, how broken it might be, even if they don't hire you to do development. And so it allows you to capture some value with them early on and bring value without building any software. Give it someone over here.
Yeah, but I wanted to build on what you said. Is for my graphic design experience in the back of the days, is the scribbled sketches brings the imagination of the client to work in the process with you instead of having something that is showing too much exactly what it's going to be. And because they don't know, they know they want something, they know how to do it, they don't know how to express it. And when you come up to something too finished, it's like if you're telling them that you didn't understand what they meant, they wanted, and there's a misfit there. So having something like really rough sketch gives the opportunity to have them forget what they had, like a already done idea in the back of their heads, and work with you with connecting with what they really want.
I found when I was going through all my old stuff, trying to find some stuff to take photos of for you guys, a roll of yellow paper. Have you guys ever seen this paper that architects used to use? I don't know if they still use it. It's this kind of really thin onion paper, yellow, bright yellow, and it was on a roll. And I unrolled it, and it was as long as this room. And it was all these sketches I had done as an undergrad for my thesis project, where I designed a theater in a park. And it was really terrible scribbles and squiggles. I wrote like no, big letters over them, and I would just keep rolling the paper out and drawing and drawing and drawing. And so it was kind of almost like a timeline of the evolution of my design ideas for this project. But it was too long to take a good photo of and bring and share. I almost brought it with me to roll it out. And I had color in there, and some ideas were really good, and I went deep on them, and I was like, no, that's no good. But instead of crumpling it up and throwing it away, I could just move it aside. And so I agree with you. Like, I used to actually have to scribble and then outline the scribble and then erase the scribble and then see what that shape made me think, and then try to draw that in. That was like a pastime I would spend just when I was waiting in a waiting room somewhere, because it just got my imagination, like letting myself see shapes in the clouds, right? And I think you're right. Almost the lower fidelity, the more the creative juices start to flow. 300%. Yes, sir.
So when it comes to building drawings, you talk about doing that in the sales phase, and I'm just curious, like, how do you discern, when it's appropriate to do it? Because oftentimes in the earlier phases of either sales or even at the beginning of the project, like it's a lot of times more breadth than depth, right? And it seems like building these these drawings can get like really complex and just again going way deeper. So how do you discern when to do that, or do you always feel like you have to at least go deep somewhere and start there?
So that's a great question. I was at fault of going too deep too early, right, for years. And even when we started switching to story mapping, started using those a little bit. I found that, again, it was too slow, too specific, even if those cards were just supposed to be reminders of the topics. So what I've arrived at is that at most I'll let myself sketch something on a whiteboard and make it really lo-fi, really rough and simple. And mostly, like David was suggesting, to make sure I understand what they want. It's more for me. And the fact that it also helps them is great, because obviously I want them to be able to correct me if I'm not understanding. And that's it. We will not get into story mapping until we actually have a discovery project that has been sanctioned and has begun. And we will not get into any kind of prototyping or usability testing and stuff until we get to past discovery and into design phase. There could be some sketches like storyboards of possible screens to help people understand the difference between a master detail or a card window. Maybe there's a quick sketch on the board, again, lo-fi, about where the users are and where the servers are and how things might connect and flow in which direction, just to make sure that I'm not losing them in terms of the technical, because a lot of our solutions involve integrations, and that is just kind of like a big question mark for clients, like how that magic voodoo happens. But I have decided that sales is not the place for anything other than a quick pencil sketch or a whiteboard sketch, and it shouldn't include it should be primary objects like squares, circles, and triangles, and it should not be like firewalls and servers. I might allow myself the occasional cylinder to represent a database, and that's it. So I think your inclination is right. Like, less is more during the sales process, and let the more technical people doing discovery downstream, maybe you with just a different hat, but let that stuff wait until you've actually got some buy-in, and you're less likely, I think, to offer them a finished project that makes them feel like this thing is already set in stone. You haven't even gotten started yet. Plus, it's faster. Right? It's much easier to move on to why should we be doing this project and what changes it going to bring to your business if we're not getting mired in the details. Yes.
Share a story. I teach a class for graduate students on professional development, and we've had an assignment where they have to make a career development plan. And it used to be write 1 to 2 pages paragraphs about your career development and how you see it. And what we were finding is that we would read all the students and they were all exactly the same. Graduate, get a job, get certified, do this, get a promotion. And there was no variability really between them. So we changed it to create a visual image of your career development plan. And there's no requirements on how to make that image other than it's visual. And so I have 18 students in the class and I get it. And I have, 18 different visualizations. There's vision boards and timelines and mind mapping and all kinds of skeleton, things. And you can really see now the individuality of the students and where they want to go. And it's a much richer experience for the students than writing that 2-page paper about where their career is going to go.
That's awesome.
And it's always really interesting to see who picks what type of visualization to see their career.
And I'm sure it's enormously instructive for all the students to see how differently their peers realize that, right? It's very boring to see everybody hand in a paper with 1,000 words. It's a very different thing to see 17 different versions of what you created thinking yours was the right way to do it. That's excellent. We're going to leave on that note.